May 24th, 1983. This is Joe Todd, an interview with Wilma Matkin, M-A-T-K-I-N.
That was before Chamber until his death in 1967. And I came over here shortly after he joined the Chamber, which of course was through the war years. In fact, we arrived just about D-Day. So that was my introduction to the Tulsa Tribune. You can imagine it was very calm and peaceful about that time. What are you going to do with this stuff?
Where were you born?
Billings, Oklahoma, over in Noble County.
When's your birthday?
October the 14th, 1907.
Who is your father?
William G. McCluskey, M-C-C-L-U-S-K-E-Y.
And who is your mother?
Lula McGovern McCluskey.
What was her first name?
Beg pardon?
What was her first name?
Lula, L-U-L-A.
Yeah, Lula. Okay. What kind of work?
L-U-L-U.
What kind of work did your father do?
Well, my grandparents came in the Cherokee Strip at the opening, and Dad and his brothers ran in Billings an implement company and hardware store, and then when oil developed in that area, they also handled oil field supplies. And he was in that business until shortly before his death, which came in, I'd have to check, I think 1938 or 39, but I'm not, I'd have to check the date to be sure.
What was your grandfather's name, the one that made the run?
James McCluskey.
And where did he come from?
Well, he and my grandmother were married in Ireland. And they came from Ireland into Canada, and then on down to the United States to St. Joe, Missouri. Then they settled on a farm in Sumner County, Kansas, where they lived until they came in at the time of the opening of the Strip. And until his death, and also other members of the family, they were wheat farmers in the Billings area.
Mm-hmm. Did you know your grandfather?
Oh, yes.
Did he ever talk about making the run, what it was like?
Oh, yes, a great deal.
What kind of stories did he tell you?
See, my granddad didn't make the run, but my uncles and my father made the run from Caldwell, Kansas. Well, of course, they tell the usual stories about lining up, and they came in by horseback. And you know the background of the run as far as that's concerned. They started to run for what we call the Shikaskia Bottoms up in K County, near Blackwell. But by the time they began to get, that was pretty well staked. So then they decided to run for what they call the Red Rock Bottoms, which is around in the Billings area. Well, my dad at that time was too young to file, but he staked, and then my uncles filed on the claims and so on. There were 3 claims that were filed there, one in the Blackwell area where an uncle of mine by the name of Henry McCluskey lived through his life. Then my grandfather's claim was about 5 or 6 miles northeast of Billings. And there was another claim in that immediate area which an uncle, John McCluskey, lived on for a number of years. The uncles grew up, matured in the Billings area. There were 3 of them in business together, Alex McCluskey, Jim McCluskey, and William McCluskey. And they had what was known as the McCluskey Implement Company in Billings, which all through my childhood up until about I think the business went about 1924. Both other uncles, Alec McCluskey and Jim McCluskey, went to California. That was many years. I couldn't even begin to tell you the approximate time, but I would say somewhere in the early 1920s, somewhere along in there, maybe before that. And my dad then continued to run the business until 1925, when it was sold.
How did, how old was your father at the time of the run? You said he was too young to make the run.
As I say, I'd have to get back to family history to find out exactly, but you had to be 21, undoubtedly, to file on a claim. So Dad was probably 18, 19 years old, somewhere in that neighborhood.
What was your uncle's name that filed on the claim?
Well, my grandfather, Henry McCluskey, filed on the North claim and so on. And then Dad staked, see, I'm going way back. Dad staked the claim north of Billings, but my grandfather then filed on it.
What kind of house did they build in the claim?
Well, the first house on what we call the home place was, it was past, in other words, there weren't the sod shanties and so on, but they built a rather substantial two-floor or two-story, just wooden farmhouse and so on, where as we were growing up as children, of course, we spent a great deal of time there and so on. The family was always very close-knit, and every Sunday, in fact, the cousins and the uncles and the aunts all congregated at the house on the what we call the home place. Then as Granddad grew older, he and my grandmother built another house about a mile northeast of that place, where they lived through their later years. And Uncle John and McCluskey and his family lived for a number of years then on this, what we call the home place. I always think that's an interesting phrase, the home place. I think it's very colloquial as far as we're concerned.
Mm-hmm. So they built the two-story house right after they staked the claim?
As far as I know, that's the only recollection I have. And from the time I would say 7 or 8 years old, the house was there. Mm-hmm. Now, what it was originally, I can't tell you because I do not know and I don't remember.
How far from Billings is the home place?
Approximately 5 miles.
North?
Northeast.
Northeast. Can you describe Billings the way it looked as a child?
Yes, very, very vividly. It was a typical small Oklahoma town. The main street was, I presume, not over 2 blocks on both the north and the south. The businesses were quite substantial, just, in other words, they were simple. The building in which my father and his brothers operated was a very substantial stone building. Many of the buildings were wooden, some were stone, and as I say, there was about two streets where the whole town congregated and so on. The rest of the town, which was residential, in other words, the house in which I grew up was probably 4 or 5 blocks north on a residential street from what we call the business district. The house that I grew up in was built by a pioneer citizen by the name of Henry Graves. Henry Graves' daughter married my uncle, Alex McCluskey. Her name was Nora. And after the Graves left, then my dad and mother moved into this house. The first house that they lived in, when I was a very small child, was just a little simple greenhouse, well, just really across the alley from this house. But this house in which I grew up, which was just a substantial one-story frame house, comfortable and so on. As I say, it was the oldest house built in Billings, and I couldn't begin to tell you. I presume it was not too many years after the strip opened.
How come your parents moved into Billings off the farm?
Well, my grandparents lived on the farm. My mother came to Billings with Joy's husband's father and mother. They had come into old Oklahoma in the run. Then they decided to move from old Oklahoma territory into the Cherokee Strip area. But Dad, of course, was already living there, and they established the business when he was relatively a young man with the other two brothers. And that would have been long before World War I. And I can't give you specific dates on that because I just don't know.
Did your parents talk about Statehood Day?
No, not much.
Okay.
I don't have too much recollection of that.
Mm-hmm. Where did you start the school?
Billings, Oklahoma.
Was that the name of the school? Just
Yes, Billings schools. I went all through grade school and high school in Billings. At that time, it was a typical, as I say, small town country school, or that is small town Oklahoma school. We felt we had a very good education. Of course, it was an entirely different thing. In fact, I lived right across the street from the schoolhouse, and everybody that came to school was within walking distance and so on. There, people who lived further out, of course, went to rural school districts.
how large was the school?
I presume at the time I went there that 100 pupils would be a very liberal estimate.
On the farm, what did you raise besides wheat?
Mostly wheat,
Mostly wheat.
and of course some cattle and poultry and hogs. It was, but wheat was the main crop. And of course my father, being in the implement business, in those days it was the days of the binders, the thrashing machines, and the thrashing crews came in, and of course everybody connected with the operation went out to bring in the wheat. And I shall never forget about the time of the war years, I was out through the harvest, and Dad was shoveling wheat, you know. They shoveled it from the old threshing machine into the wagons and then carted it into the elevator. And I always remember he saying, "Now, honey, look at this wheat. This is $3 a bushel wheat. You'll never see that again in all your life."
How many men are in a thrashing crew?
I would say on the binders, you see, they hired the threshers to come in, as they do combines nowadays. But then there were the people who, we all cut our own wheat with the binders. And neighbors came in and helped on the harvest and so on. You'd kind of go from one farm to the other and so on. But of course, whoever had the farmhouse, in other words, my aunts, and always went out when the harvest was on, out to Granddad McCluskey's, and they always fixed food and so on. And my recollection would be maybe 15 to 20, somewhere in that neighborhood.
What were your chores in thrashing time?
Oh, I didn't have any. I was just there.
Well, you didn't help your mother cook?
I was just a pest. No, you see, I was pretty young at that time. Even though I'm rather elderly now, that was a long time ago. No, I had no, but as I say, my mothers and aunts, they'd cook for days before, not for days, but before the thrashers came in, you see, there was great preparations of food and so on, much fried chicken and pies and this and that and the other. But I was too young for that. I was just underfoot.
What were your chores around the house as a child?
Oh, not too much. Uh, this is not bragging, but we were what you call comfortably situated people. And we always had hired girls. Um, in other words, a hired girl was almost a member of the family. They came and stayed with you. And I remember my dad always laughed that there were two or three hired girls who were married in our home. And Dad said he never understood why they always came to the McCluskeys and got married. That it was either because he thought he and my mother were so delightful, had such a delightful married life, or else they thought it was such a horrible situation they didn't want to get anything like that. But I grew up as any child at that time. Oh, we learned to dust, and I learned to cook when I was very young, you know, in a minor sort of a way and so on. But as far as actually having specific chores, we didn't have. I had a younger brother who is no longer alive by the name of Harry McCluskey. But we led the life of typical small-town Oklahoma kids. We went to school, and we had guys around all the time, you know, from school, and there was always hot bread and sugar and so on and so forth. And we were not oppressed in any way as far as work was concerned, even in my high school days. I worked like any girl growing up around the home, but it was minor stuff. As I say, Mom taught me to cook, and I liked to clean up and dust and so on and so forth. But it was just minor housework.
Back to the thrashing crew, besides the binder and the thrasher, were there any other pieces of machinery used?
Except the wagons in which they hauled the grain.
How does a thrasher operate? How does it work?
Oh, it was a great. Have you ever seen a picture of a thrashing machine?
From a distance.
It was a great big instrument with a high smokestack. It looked a little bit like an old-time locomotive. And they threw the bales. You see, all the wheat was hand-shocked. And they came along and gathered it up in the wagons, brought it in, and threw it in the thrashing machine. And it was run through the thrashing machine. The straw came out one place. The grain came out a chute into the wagons and so on. And it was coal-fired.
Was it the steam engine?
Yeah.
Steam-powered?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How big is a shock of wheat?
About the size of that table.
About 2-3 feet in diameter?
It stood about so, and not quite. Well, it'd be about the size of that.
About 2-3 feet in diameter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it was all bound by hand?
Yeah. The shockers, as they were called, went along with twine, and the grain was gathered and wound and stood up and so on. Then when the wagons came along, it was picked up by pitchfork, put in the wagons, and taken to the thrashing machine.
When did you see your first combine?
I imagine that it was after I came back from my first college years, maybe, which would be in the late 20s or very early 30s. And I still don't know much about a combine. My husband was a very good friend of Fred, I believe it was, who was one of the younger
Fred
Drummonds.
Yeah.
That was after they were both adults, though, and were associated through Oklahoma State University.
During the war years, was there much organized war activity in Billings?
We see, I wasn't in, well, in the first war year, see, I was quite young at that time. And I remember my mother going to Red Cross, but I suppose they roll bandages and people knit, but as far as too much actual war activity, I don't recall too much about it.
Hmm.
Of course, that one thing that might interest you, that was the time, of the terrific influenza epidemic. And my mother nursed day and night. Of course, people were very ill and dying. And the day the armistice was signed, I was very, very ill with the influenza. And I must have been, sort of half hazy. But I remember these two little pals of mine coming up and sitting on the edge of the bed, and both of them were waving American flags. It was Armistice Day.
Hmm. So your armistice day was in bed with the influenza.
With the influenza.
Hmm.
Let's see, in 1918, how old would I be? I'd have to figure it up.
11 years old.
11 years old. So you see, I wasn't a very mature adult at that time.
Were there many deaths in Billings from the influenza?
Uh, I presume it would be about normal.
Right.
There were a number of deaths.
Hmm.
But it wasn't, as I recall, a terrific, horrible epidemic of deaths. There was much illness. And as I said, Mom nursed people day and night. But, of course, 11 years old, you're not conscious too much of what's going on either.
In the 20s,
Hmm?
how long did you live in Billings?
I lived there until 1924 when I went down to the University of Oklahoma.
Hmm.
And to all intents and purposes, of course, I was home for holidays. But that was really, that ended my life in Billings as far as actually being there. It was college and so on from there on.
Did you live on campus?
What?
Did you live on campus at Norman?
In a sorority house,
Which one?
Chi Omega.
Chi Omega. How many girls were in the house?
35 or 40.
Can you describe Rush Week?
Yes, yes, yes. It was very different than it is now. In those days, through the summer, you received bids, or that is invitations, to various houses. And you accepted these invitations and went to these various parties and so on. Then we went to a bid house. Everybody congregated. All the women who had gone through Rush went to this bid house. And you filled out a slip which you gave your first, second, and third preference as far as sororities were concerned. Then the dear sisters came by and picked you up and took you to the house. And it was really a very cruel thing, because part of these gals, you see, had no bids, and they'd stand there. You can imagine what would happen to a child who was left standing and everybody else being carted off someplace to a sorority. It was a very wicked, I think nowadays, and I pay not too much attention to it, but it's handled much better, much better.
That could get kind of cruel.
It is, it was.
Were there many flappers at the university?
Well, I guess we all were, weren't we? You see, I was young when I went to college. I was 15 my first year, if I remember correctly, and so on. But it was a flapper age, and in those days, they allowed no cars on campus. We had to be in the house by 10 o'clock at night. And we had a house mother who ran herd. And if you were not in by 10 o'clock, it was probably better to stay out all night, because she probably didn't even know you were gone, rather than come in and face her.
How did the flappers dress? What was the fashion?
Oh, we wore, that was before the days of skirts, and we dressed pretty fancy. Fancier than kids much so. It was ordinary dresses, and we did wear hats. Mostly we wore high heels, and of course dresses were very short and so on. And you wore rayon hose, They were always baggy, and you rolled them below the knees, and we wore these close hats, you know, when we put a hat on.
Hmm. Did you marcel your hair?
I bobbed my hair um, before I left high school, and my father was very irate. I was a scarlet woman. He could not tolerate it. In fact, I remember we went to the dinner table after my hair was bobbed. In those days, we went down to the barber shop and had our hair cut, and it was just cut. Well, Mom told me to be a little careful about bringing up anything and so on. But listen to this Dad said himself. Well, he saw it. But from then on, it was short hair.
What did he say?
Oh, Lord, I don't remember. But any woman that would bob her hair was not a lady. That was a cinch. And, of course, this, those have been cigarettes and so on. And being an Irish family, there was always liquor available. In other words, you had a drink of liquor like you had a drink of coffee and so on. As I say, you know, liquor to an Irishman's like bread. It was never abused in any way. There wasn't the type of drinking that on the holidays when we were out at Granddad's for Christmas and Thanksgiving, the uncles would have maybe a jug of hard cider out in the wood house. And they'd go out and take several nips of hard cider. But my dad was very, very adamant about cigarettes. He would not allow anyone to work for him who smoked a cigarette. And I never smoked a cigarette in front of my father to the day he died. As I say, that was the end. There was only one type of woman who smoked cigarettes.
Who had the first car in Billings?
My dad.
What kind was it?
An old Veely. Have you ever heard of a Veely?
No, ma'am.
Well, in the process of my dad also, I didn't mention this, but for a period of several years, they also had a business in Enid. And my dad, now I'm not positive that my dad had the first car in Billings, but it was he and Dr. Mayberry over at Enid had the first two cars in Enid. Well, this old Veely was a great big red thing, didn't have any doors on the front or the back. I was telling my mechanic about it the other day. He was about your age, and he went into ecstasy. Had a top that you put up, and if it was bad weather, you put side curtains on. The lights on the front were what they called carbide lights. And when it got dark, you had to get out and light the carbide lights and so on. And of course, it was cranked by hand. Well, Dad had this car for years after we lived in Enid for a while he was operating the business over there. And then when we came back to Billings, we still had this old Veely, which he affectionately referred to as Old Betsy. Then, but I don't know how many years, all my period of growing up, I remember this old red car. But again, as I say, we were a very close-knit family, and we were always out to Granddad McCluskey every Sunday. That was just par for the course. Well, my uncles, particular one, Uncle Woodson Long and Aunt Cassie, were still driving a buggy and horse at that time. Well, they had two cousins. In fact, one was just finished spending 2 weeks with me. But they came out to Granddad's with the buggy. Mm-hmm. And across, it was just, you know, a single buggy. And they had a board across in front of their feet, and that's where the girls rode. Well, Harry, my brother, and I were absolutely intrigued, you see, with the horse and buggy. And the girls were completely intrigued with the car. So when we came home about 5 o'clock in the evening, Harry and I would ride in with the buggy with Aunt Cassie and Uncle Woodson. And the girls would ride in the car with Mom and Dad.
Mm-hmm. You say there were no cars at the university at that time.
As I recall, a person could have a car on weekends. But no cars. When we went to dances, we went by buses that ran or we walked. But no cars on the campus. Now I say that here that you can't find a place to park down there because of student cars.
What did you study at the university?
My first year in college, well, I had a general, what you would call a general course that freshmen took at that time. I had English and French, science, and then I was a dramatic art major for my first years in college. So I had a good deal of dramatic art. I have a transcript in here. I can get it out and let you see what it actually was if you want to see it. Is that important?
Well, that's okay. Maybe later.
It was what you'd call just a general course.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't begin to specialize then, as you do now.
Yeah.
But you had the basics, reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Who was your favorite professor?
My, what?
Who was your favorite professor?
Well, at the University of Oklahoma, we had a great many, at that time, even student assistants that handled freshmen. And you see, I was only there 1 year, then I went up to Washburn.
Okay.
So as far as having a favorite professor there, I remember my high school teachers much more than I do my first year college professors and so on.
Tell me about your high school teachers then.
Well, they were very competent and very interesting. One little gal, what in the devil was her name? Ena Heaton was a very prominent teacher in Billings High School. The superintendent was a man by the name of Mr. Elliott. And this, my cousin brought over a scrapbook from Billings High School, which she would have enjoyed seeing, but she took it home with her. But we had in other words, the social life certainly pleased us and so on.
What did you enjoy the most in high school? What form of recreation?
Well, you know, I think I just liked it all.
Mm-hmm.
I played basketball, I played tennis, and of course we had football teams. And of course I liked all the fall roll, all the parties and this and that and the others. And of course boys, naturally, were quite important at that phase. Very sophisticated gentlemen.
What about Halloween?
Oh, Halloween was not, in other words, I didn't know anything about tricks and treats. There was a lot of deviltry that went on. In those days, you know, there were outside toilets. And one of the famous deals, these kids would get out and they'd tie a rope around one of these outside toilets and drag it up the main street. My father always told the story that one Halloween night we had an old town marshal by the name of George Pearson. And these kids were dragging this Dominecker, as we referred to him, up the street on a rope. And old George pulled his pistol out and shot in the air. And about that time the rope broke and it caught one of these kids on the fanny. And he screamed, "Oh my God, boys, he got me." And I remember one night, my dad was a very jovial sort of a person. In fact, every kid in the country called him Bill. My uncle, Mr. Long, said they'd be walking up the street and they'd say, "How do you do, Mr. Long?" "Hi, Bill." That type of individual. He was a jovial Irishman. But one Halloween night, and how they did it, I don't know, but they came up and barricaded all our doors and windows in the house, and we couldn't get out. And we had Halloween parties, typical corn, popcorn balls. We bobbed for apples, and we dressed up in various costumes and so on and so forth. There was never really what you called a big community Halloween. 4th of July was the big celebration in a small town at that time.
What'd you do on the 4th of July?
Oh, all the merchants put booths out in front of the store. And everybody went downtown about 9 o'clock in the morning, dressed up in their guest garb, and we walked around the 2 blocks of the street all day long. Then at night, of course, there was no general fireworks display, but each family had its own fireworks display. And there were horse races that ran up and down these dirt roads in front of our houses and so on, and ball games. Every small town had a ball team. And Garber used to play Billings, and Billings used to play Red Rock, and that sort of a thing. So that was just, and food, of course, running out of your ears. The churches generally had food available, maybe in a downtown building where people went to eat.
What was the name of the business in Enid that your father ran?
John Deere Implement Company.
John Deere. Did your family ever do any work in the oil fields?
No, not as such. Joy, you better sit down here. Maybe you can't talk about Billings, Oklahoma, but maybe you can add something. He want to know what I did when I went to high school and this, that, and the other. But when I was very young, the Hoover Field, which was the first oil development, came in somewhere, I think about 1920. You'd have to verify that date. And it was the first oil development in that part of the country. Of course, my father was interested, but as far as he sold equipment, but as far as actually doing any oil field work, he never did. But I was telling Joy or somebody the other day, the first well that came in was the old Hoover number 1. Dad came up to the house. It was dark and cold. And he got me out of bed, started dressing me and put my clothes on, and Mom said, "What are you going to do with the baby?" And he said, "I'm going to take her out to see the Hoover number 1 come in." And Mom said, "Wilma McCluskey, you're not going to take that child out there." "Yes, I am. She'll never forget it." Well, I've never forgot it. Those were the days of the old spudders. Well, I stretched out and went to sleep on the... did you ever see an old-time oil rig? They had benches built around. But anyway, I stretched out, as I remember, on the bench. And in the process, so much gas was coming up, I became violently ill. Well, the old Hoover came in, and I saw it come in. In those days, they just went high, wide, and handsome. They didn't even think about catting as they do now. But that was my first recollection. Then Billings, of course, became a typical oil town with this development of what they called the Hoover Field. And it was packed, mud streets, mostly the pipe and equipment was hauled largely by horse-drawn drays and so on. The mud was so deep that people would go in almost up to their knees and so on. Well, of course, the field began to peter out. But while I was still in high school, Three Sands came in. And of course, it was a much larger, more booming field. So it was a very, kids from Billings, went up and I said we did everything we were big enough to do and some things we weren't big enough to do. But we hung around the fields a lot. And Three Sands, of course, was a typical shack town and so on and so forth. But the field was very extensive, and all these wooden derricks, and sometimes you'd see the oil coming up of 6 and 8 wells at a time, just filling the sky. And at night, the derricks were filled with lights. My dad always said it reminded him of a ship harbor. In other words, you looked out and here were all these lighted rigs and so on. Well, of course, Three Sands began to peter out. It reached its heyday at about 26 and 27. And then by the time I went to Tonkawa, where I ran this news bureau, it was beginning. In other words, Three Sands. See, these shack towns would develop, and then when the field began to disappear, they just disappeared too. So when I went to Tonkawa, of course, became a very active oil boom town. But that was tapering off by the time I got there, 1928.
1928. What were the oil field workers like? What kind of people were they?
The what?
The oil field workers that lived in the shack towns. What kind of people were they?
Well, they were rough and ready. Now, I'm talking about the men. Of course, women were women. First, all the bawdy houses and the gals and so on. But the oil field worker was a big guy and a rough guy. But he didn't go around mugging women and children. In other words, he picked on his own kind. In other words, there were fights, and there were gunfights, and this and that and the other. But they were very decent sort of people. Hard drinking, hard working. I remember one time, I'm just talking, I say whatever interests you, but me and some of my pals had gone out to one of these joints in Three Sands.
What kind of joint was it?
Oh, it was a restaurant, bawdy house, drinking, corn whiskey spot, where we had no business be. But my date was a kid by the name of Ab Whelan, who we grew up with, so on. Well, there's a big old lease boss by the name of Sam Townsend. He ran the Bidco lease down the Hoover Field. So one of these guys who was pretty well drunk came along and picked up Ab's necktie. And he said, "Sure is a pretty necktie, boy. I'm going to cut it off from you." So he pulled out this knife. About that time, old Sam showed up, and he was big as the side of a barn. And he said, "Hey, don't you know who that brat is? That's Bill McCluskey's brat. You let him alone." And then he said to me, "Brat, get out of here, quick." Well, that was the type, you see, of thing. And of course, the gals who plied their trade, there was never, I suppose at that time, we knew their business, but we talked and visited and so on. There was never any part of that life, you see, that infringed on us. But we were just a gang of kids running around the field, and all the roughnecks and everybody else looked out after us. Oh, I'm sure there were mean characters, but it was an entirely different world. Now, I'd be as safe in a booming oil field at 10 o'clock at night, even a young girl, as I was in my own home. I'm much safer than walking down the mall in Tulsa. As I say, it was rough and ready.
But the roughnecks looked out for you.
But as I say, they picked on their own kind. Mm-hmm. If there was a fight, it was between two. Of course, you see, there were various categories. There were drillers, tool dressers, and roughnecks, and of course the drillers were the top echelon. And the tool dressers probably came in second, and then the roughnecks and the roustabouts and so on.
Of course, we had prohibition at that time, so where did the liquor come from?
Well, we had prohibition at that time, but we also had stills. And corn whiskey, first drink of liquor I ever had in my life was out of a pork fruit jug of corn whiskey. And we were talking the other day, I said there was not much danger of becoming addicted to corn whiskey, because this is going to be shocking to me on the record. I'm talking to you. But any kid that took a drink of corn whiskey got so sick that he couldn't stand anything for the next 3 or 4 weeks. But there were stills that operated. And of course there's always, you see in Oklahoma, you see in territorial days, and even after statehood, you were allowed to bring liquor in. I know my dad ordered liquor and beer from Kansas City. Now what the regulation was, it couldn't be sold openly because of the Indian liquor laws. And of course then after the corn whiskey days, the bootleggers came in and so on. But in my youth, I can't remember too much where, of course, liquor was available. Liquor's always available. But I don't remember any particular bootleggers or this, that, the other. That is, not as they developed in later years with Prohibition.
You say you went to Washburn from the University
Yes.
of Oklahoma.
I went to Washburn in 1926.
And what did you study there?
Fine arts, primarily.
Fine arts.
But that's where I became interested in journalism.
Okay.
But I was a fine arts major, and journalism was my minor. Mm-hmm. And I was really in journalism school in Washburn as much as fine arts school. As I said, the first newspaper I ever did any work for was the Peakadilly Capital when I was in school. And I definitely remember.
What was the name of the paper?
The Peakadilly Capital.
Okay.
And that was just student work. But I definitely remember, of course, at that age, I was completely enamored with the romance of the newspaper business. And this journalism instructor I had, his name was Birch. Well, he always conducted his class by sitting on the desk and putting his feet on a chair in front of him. Well, I thought that was probably the most sophisticated thing, that ever happened. And one of my first things that happened to me in a newspaper office, I was doing some work up at the Capitol, and one of these guys became very angry about something. The Capitol was on the third floor of a building, as I recall. And he walked over and threw his typewriter out of the window. That I've always remembered.
And you went to Tonkawa in 1928.
Yes, but before that, I came back from college, and I did go my last year. That's when things got pretty tough financially. So I came back to Billings and was there for a short time. Then I went to work in the spring of 1927 for the Blackwell Tribune, which was owned by the Bellotti family. That is, one of the sons still has the Stillwater Press. And I was with them for, I would say, 8 or 9 months. And I was telling someone the other day there were 2 papers, a morning and an evening paper. And we worked 12 hours a day, and I drew $18 a week.
What'd you do for them?
Everything.
Everything.
Just, of course, that time I was just a cub reporter, so they didn't turn me loose on anything very important. But, I remember the first thing I covered was a cooking school. But I was not there too long. Then I went back to Topeka and stayed a month or 2 out of a job, and got a job on the Great Bend Tribune in Great Bend, Kansas. And I was only there about 8 or 9, well, less than that, probably about 8 months. And Clyde Butchmore called from Ponca City and wanted to know if I would come down and go to work for the Ponca City News. So I went to the Ponca City News in 1928 and was on the staff there until, well, as I say, these years kind of dovetail. But I went to Tonkawa. Then they sent me over to Tonkawa to run a news bureau over there. It first was the Ponca City News. Then they joined hands with the Blackwell Tribune. And I operated this news bureau over there. And at that time, my husband was teaching journalism out at Northern Junior College. So I was there, ran this news bureau. It later, I don't know whether you remember in newspaper history, but C.R. Bellotti and Lew Wentz became involved in a very bitter political fight, and Lew Wentz set up an opposition paper in Blackwell called the Blackwell Journal. Well, later, shortly after I went to Tonkawa, the Blackwell Tribune went broke and dropped out of the picture. So then I ran this news bureau for the Blackwell Journal and the Ponca City News, and also was a stringer for the Oklahoman.
Now you say a stringer.
Well, that meant that, in other words, you provided anything that came up in your correspondent would be the way you'd use now. Any story that evolved around Tonkawa that I thought was worthwhile, I turned to the Oklahoman or the Associated Press.
Okay. So that was your main job in the news bureau in Tonkawa, was just providing news for the area.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Everything. Football. I covered football, track, anything, city council. You just covered anything.
Where was your office in Tonkawa?
It was a small building. I had 2 offices. There was, my first office was on what we call South Main Street, right off of the main street, and it was right behind a bank there. Well, I was there for probably 3 years, and then I moved into an upstairs office building right over a drugstore right off of the main street.
While you were there, what were some of the main stories that you came in contact with?
Well, my biggest story, we had a very famous murder. And let me get these names. There were two school teachers, and they left Blackwell early in the morning to drive back to Norman. And a guy by the name of Earl, who was later convicted, Earl Quinn, stopped them south of Tonkawa. He was a apparent dope addict and also drunk, and killed and raped both of them. Well, he was later apprehended and so on. He was a hanger-on around the fields and sent to the penitentiary and then electrocuted. But that thing went on for months. It got to the point where it haunted me. I thought, if I have to listen to this, just one development after the other and so on. And after they finally electrocuted Quinn down at Big Back, and this chief of police in Tonkawa said, Wilma, do you want to go down to Earl Quinn's electrocution? I can get you in. You're the woman that's worked on this story day in and day out. If you want to see Earl electrocuted. And I said, I never want to hear the name Earl Quinn again. I can't think of these teachers' names. But anyway, I was over here. My husband and I had come over to spend the weekend. The bodies were found on a Sunday night, and I had a supply person working for me in Tonkawa. So he called me and said, get back over here as quickly as you can. There's been this big murder, and they're driving us crazy and so on. And then I went through a bank robbery. They robbed the First National Bank, which was my office, right in front of my office. You know where I was? Home in bed. But I had these both morning and afternoon papers, so I worked down there late at night. And I used to sit there and think, what would I do if we were just, in other words, I could go right into the bank through a little anteroom there. And I thought, what would I do if they robbed the bank when I was down here at night? Well, they robbed the bank about 9 o'clock in the morning, and you know me, I was in bed. Then there were just numerous, there were stories, but not a worldwide import or anything like that. Not even as shaking as commercial stories would be nowadays, because life was a pretty even tenor then. Of course, there was depression, and we went through the horrible Dust Bowl days.
Now, were you still in Tonkawa at this time?
I was in Tonkawa.
What was Tonkawa like in those days? What kind of town was it?
Well, Tonkawa has always been a very nice little city. It has a population of around 4,500, and it's a college town. Northern Oklahoma Junior College is located there. The college used to be University Preparatory School, and it was one of the land-grant colleges that was set up at the state at the time of statehood. Then later, it became a junior college and so on, state-supported.
How did the depression affect you?
Well, fortunately, Ben was at the college, and I had two newspapers. As I say, drawing a magnificent salary of maybe $18 or $20 a week. But we had money coming in all the time. But it definitely, Tonkawa being the small town that it was not hurt. In other words, we didn't have people selling apples on the corners. In other words, the community more or less took care of itself. But many young people, younger or of your age, who had been working, came home to stay with their parents. There wasn't any other place to go. And I've told Joy many times, as I said, I had a morning paper, so I was generally, anyway, 8:30 or 9 o'clock before I'd get home. And here'd be all these guys sitting around on the floor. Of course, Ben was there. And I said, you haven't had anything to eat, have you? And they said, nope. So I cooked hamburgers. At that time, hamburger was 10 cents a pound. But well, probably the most amusing story. Of course, the bank's closed for the bank holiday. And Ben and I were married on June the 5th, 1931, which was the height of the Depression. Well, the bank, of course, we'd gone through the bank holiday at that time. But we were going up to Wisconsin to school that summer. Ben was taking his master's up there. So he came home and said, you know, I sure hate to ask you to do this, but you're going to have to sign a note so we have some money to go to Wisconsin. He had looked at his bank balance and he thought he had so much, probably $200 or $300, you know, which was a tremendous bank balance at that time. Instead, he was overdrawn that much. So the first official act of my married life was to sign a bank note. But we did not suffer through the Depression.
How long did you stay in Tonkawa?
I was there from 1929 to 1944 when I came over here.
Any major war stories that you covered?
The what?
How about the war in Tonkawa? You're still at the...
Well, it was a very lively place during the war years. They established a PW camp north of town. And the first prisoners brought into the United States, if I recall, I think I'm right on that, Joey, were put in the Tonkawa camp. They were Africa Corps men. And, of course, we lived with the military. They were military police and so on. And the officers out there, in other words, they were at our house and we were out at the club, you know, just a general mix-up and so on. But the camp was a typical PW camp.
Did you get to know any of the prisoners?
Hmm?
Did you get to know any of the prisoners?
Yes. Not intimately, but it was these African Corps men. Well, let me start at the beginning when they brought them in. There was a nurse in camp and myself, newspaper. So we were the only two women that they allowed in camp when the prisoners were brought in. Well, of course, they had guns, you know, all around and this, that, and the other. And they put this nurse and I think they had us in the officers' club. But we could see the prisoners come in. Well, they were tattered, but they were a magnificent-looking group of men. And when they saw all these guns, you see, way out here in the middle of the United States of America, they really laughed. They pointed the guns, wondered what in the wide world they were going to do with them. But anyway, the camp operated until the end of the war, although they began to move the prisoners out before I came over here. It was practically gone. And over at the Officers Club on Saturday night, you know, being Germans, they love to sing. So the Commandant would allow them to come over to the Officers Club and give them beer. They'd sing for us and so on. But as far as any intimate relationship, no, there was nothing like that allowed. But they told two of them escaped and went down to Texas. Well, within about 10 days, they came back. They couldn't get any place outside of Texas. But they did beautiful work, their quarters, and I never saw this either because it was all you know, promoting another word. But they said they did very beautiful carving and handwork, and these frame buildings in which they lived, they had carved very beautifully and painted and so on. Now, I never saw this. I just heard the guys out there talk about it and so on.
Now, the camp is just north of Tonkawa, you say?
Yes, just about a mile north of Tonkawa.
Is it still there?
Hmm?
Is it still there, the buildings?
There may be a shell, but not much more than that.
Okay.
Not that you could really see. Maybe some foundations. I really don't know what's up there.
What about Pearl Harbor Day?
Who?
Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th.
Oh, well, we were in Pearl Harbor Day in Tonkawa, of course, and I remember that we heard over the radio that Pearl Harbor had been attacked and so on and so forth. So everybody started gathering together and so on, and we decided we needed to go over to Ponca City to see what was happening over there. So we went over to Ponca City, and everybody got together and had a drink or two, you know, and wondered what was going to happen and so on. but nothing very. In other words, we just wrote it out, just like everybody else did, shocked, not knowing what was going to happen. And of course, at that time, very excited. You know, war was quite romantic in those days.
Were there any organized war activities in Tonkawa?
Red Cross and first aid. I went through first aid classes, and there. Oh yes, they had a pilot training school out at the college. They call it liaison pilot training, and my husband taught out there. They and of course there was a big English uh, training uh, flying school over at Ponca City that was known as the DAR School. So they, I say, my husband taught. He used to be an officer of the day and so on. This time, you see, they were just building the camp. Everything was going on. But Ben would have to go out when he was officer of the day, maybe 4:30 in the morning, and so on. And through that period too, in addition to my two newspapers, I went to work with the National Youth Administration. They worked with, well, it was basically pilot training and actually radio, radio. And they worked it hand in hand with DAR. Not out at the college, but with DAR. So I went to work.
DAR?
That was a big British flying school over at Ponca.
Okay.
So I went to work for the National Youth Administration, and I was communications and so on. In other words, I just handled any public relations that came along. And it was quite a big school. We had kids come in from all part of the country and so on. And I was with them, well, I can't remember, they closed it out toward the, long before I came to Tulsa.
Were there any WPA or CCC activities in Tonkawa in the 30s?
Not in Tonkawa. There were people who, I can't recall any there. Now there might have been, but there was nothing like a camp, you know, or anything like that. But there probably were projects that people worked on.
How come you and your husband moved to Tulsa?
Well, he was offered, he was, as I say, he was kind of felt that he wanted to get out of teaching. And at that time, he was offered a position down on the faculty at journalism faculty at OSU, and he also was offered this job on the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce. Well, as I say, he kind of sort of felt that he'd like to change a career, you know, and leave teaching, so he came over here. Well, then I was in Tonkawa for 6 months, winding up things before I came over to join him. And first day I was here, well, they'd been, you know, newspapers were very hard hit for people to work for them at that time. So long before I came over here, Bill Stevens, who was managing editor down at the Trib, kept pounding Bill or Ben on his back, saying, "When's your wife coming over? When's your wife?" Well, I had no intention of coming over here and going right to work. But anyway, I was over for a weekend, and Bill said, "When do you go to work for us?" And I said, "Well, as soon as I can get organized, get here." And we planned to be over here around the 1st of June. So he said, "Okay, we'll want you just as soon as you can come up." So that's where I started. Harlan Phillips, who was the managing editor that I worked with as an assistant, used to shake his head when I would pull some of my famous stunts. And he'd say, "Mrs. Matkin, I knew Stevens was desperate, but I didn't know he was that desperate."
What kind of stunts did you pull?
Beg pardon?
What kind of stunts did you pull?
I didn't get that.
What kind of stunts
an editor has to put up with a reporter.
What was your first job with the Tribune?
Uh, really, the first job I had when I came over here, I worked with Stevens, who was managing editor at that time. And he stayed here only about 6 months after that. Phillips was city editor at that time. So I worked with Stevens, part-time on the desk, but mainly I put out a feature page that was part local and part canned and so on. Then after Phillips came on, I sort of continued on. I wasn't, well, it was a peculiar situation. In other words, I worked side by side with the managing editor, and when the managing editor was away, I sat at his desk and took care of the nitty-gritty and so on and so forth. And of course, I didn't make any life and death decisions as far as the paper. I just was just an assistant, that was all. Then I branched out. After I became associated with Phillips, I put out an outdoor page, which we inaugurated, which we covered all the lakes and this and that and this other. And Phillips always told me that I was the only outdoor editor in the United States who'd never caught a fish, which was about right. But anyway, I put out the outdoor page for a number of years. And in the meantime, I also had just general assignments. I had the fairgrounds and agriculture. I wrote a cattle column and was known as the top hand. And that was always very amusing. Some of these old boys would come in and say, I want to talk to the top hand. My name was never published. Well, they expected, to see some hardy cowboy. And when they'd see me, they'd do a double take. The top hand? Then I had the Tulsa Tribune spelling bee for about 20 years, which was an interesting activity. It really took up several months each year. We had local bees here, and then I took a kid back to Washington to a national spelling bee and so on and so forth. And I had that until I left the Tribune, actually. Then the last 4 or 5 years I was on the Tribune, I was church editor. And you know what a church editor does. And all the time I did special assignments and so on and so forth. Travel stories, this, that, and the other. I was just a jack of all trades.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me about VJ Day in Tulsa, when the Japanese surrendered, World War II ended?
Well, I was not downtown. Seems to me that was on a... Anyway, we were at home. But I don't recall too much activity. Now, that's peculiar, but we were here at the house. And did you ever hear the name Jim Lucas? Jim was a very famous combat correspondent and a close friend of ours. His brother Bob was on the Tribune staff. Well, Jim and these two gals called and said, we're coming out to celebrate VJ Day. And I said, well, we don't have anything to drink in the house. I think there's about 1 drink apiece, so we're not going to celebrate very big. And they said, well, we can't get anything because even the bootleggers weren't operating. So I don't remember any particular except just the...
What were some of the most interesting stories you covered in Tulsa during your time with the Tribune?
Well, you see, I was never on crime or anything like that. So my stories were more, in other words, you'd say I did more interpretive reporting than any, well, if there was a spot news story and so on. But none of the, in other words, I was never on police, I was never on courthouse or anything like that. As I say, I would have been known today In other words, I did surveys. I did surveys, well, for instance, type of work. We did a series on adoptive children, that type of thing. We did a series on low-cost housing. And we did church series of various sorts, one of which pertained to what changing churches and what the ministers in various denominations thought. But as far as any big crime stories or anything like that, I don't remember particularly. I was working down at the office. It might be of interest. The day that Roosevelt died. It was a very bad rainy night with tornadoes flitting around and so on and so forth. Well, Phillips, the only people in the office was the state editor, old Doc Murray, and myself, and we were still putting out extras at that time. And we were allowed to extra up until, I think our agreement with the World, but we could extra up to 6, and then we were not allowed to extra, or that was the agreement. Then the World could extra from then on. Well, Phil had wandered out someplace. He was across the street having a drink with a friend, in fact. And Doc and I were there, and I said, Doc, what are we going to do? And he said, we're going to put out a paper. And I said, we don't have it okay. And he said, well, I'm going to start it, and you see if you can get Phillips. So I ran through the rain where I knew Phillips was hanging out and grabbed him, and I said, the president's just died. Doc started an extra. So he came on the dead run and so on. This old Doc Murray was a very colorful newspaper man. He worked on the Kansas City Star at the time that Spanish-American War was on. And Doc said said, this reminds me, he told me this story that night, said, it reminds me, I was on the Bulldog when the Spanish-American War ended. And I thought there ought to be an extra put out, and I didn't have any verification, from the brass. But he said, I went ahead anyway and put out this extra. Well, when the next morning, when the brass came in, the executive editor looked at it, said he had this line probably on 80-point type, and he said, yeah, that's a good extra. Glad you put it out. But said that type, my God, I was saving that type for the second coming.
Did you ever interview anyone that was involved in the race riot?
Interview what?
Anyone that was involved in the race riot in 1921?
Oh, no. No, that was too far. And that was pretty verboten. You see, the Tribune was given the credit of starting the race riot. It was an inflammatory story about an attack on a white woman. So the race riot, in fact, all of Tulsa has tried to keep hands off of the race riot. Let's forget it. It was horrible. Let's forget it.
Mm-hmm.
But I had no connection or anything like that. I remember the day they shot Martin Luther King. The North Side boys, the blacks, were out on their motorcycles, running up and down the streets of downtown Tulsa. And that was the first time I was ever nervous. And I thought I'd better get out of here and get home as quickly as I can. Well, at that time, I was really very nervous all that night, not knowing what was going to happen. But I had a very lovely colored woman who worked for me at that time, and she always brought her young son. Well, the next morning, Millie was out here, and she always sang all the time she worked. So she started to work and sing, and I thought, what's wrong with me? Nothing's going to happen. You...
Mm-hmm. In the feature page and the outdoor page, what basically were your days like working for the paper? What was your average day like?
You mean by day off, or what?
No, working for the paper.
Yes. How many days I worked?
What was your average day like?
Oh, my average day like? Oh, well, when I was putting out the outdoor page, I came down. I never came to work too early. I came in about 9. The rest of the staff had been in a long time. And I would have written reports of what was happening on the various lakes. I would call the various dock owners to see what was going on, get reports of who caught what fish and so on. If it was in a game season, I would, or if there was something going along with the wildlife department, I'd check the wildlife department and just develop any kind of a story that was of interest as far as hunters or fishermen were concerned. And generally, uh, then I turned all this copy over as it came into the state editor, and he edited and made up, which was not too much of a job as far as making up and out. Well, it was. And of course, we took a great many pictures. Had people would come in with stuff, you know, that fish they had caught, and I took so many pictures of poor little deer strung over automobile radiators that I never wanted to see one again. But that was typical as far as that was concerned. And you were asking about something else?
What about the feature page?
Oh, the feature page. Well, that, you see, I made that up and edited it. So it was just merely a matter of, there would be feature stories from the staff that would come in. Maybe the city editor had assigned them. And it was a lot of canned stuff, columns that we carried, and so on. So it was just a matter of making up the page, and in other words, I didn't write much for it. Oh, I'd do a story every once in a while, but I basically was the editor on the feature page.
Do any typesetting?
No. No. I was around the composing room a lot, and I stood over while they made up pages, but never any typesetting and so on. It's sure a new world now.
Yeah.
New world now. Oh, stereotyping. No. Oh, there's a form of stereotyping they do, but it's a completely different world. It's a completely different world. And of course, everybody works on the word processors now.
Mm-hmm.
So
I was
typewriters.
going to ask you how it's changed.
Well, from my time, in the days when I started to work, we had a telegrapher who worked on a key, and the news came in over the wire. There was no such thing as printers. And it was not until, I can't remember whether, I think we had printers out at Great Bend, but I'm not sure. And of course, when I came over here, and those were the days of the old, you know, full flash photography and so on. And the first pictures that came over the wire came in while I was working here, and that was telephoto, when they were the dots, you know, that came on the metal, and then it was taken downstairs and developed down there with, or that is, stereotyped down there. But now, of course, there is, as I say, the typewriters have gone. The printers came, or that is, the word processors came in about a year after I left. They've been talked about it long before. But they came in cold type, and all the change in the paste ups and so on and so forth, that all developed down at the Trib after I left. So in the 7 years that I've been away from the Trib, there have been more changes in newspapering than the approximate 50 years I worked before. It's a new world.
Mm-hmm.
And at the expense of sounding like an old square, I'm not sure it's good. The writing, to me, is, and errors creep in too often, and it's impossible, I think, to work visually as one has to do on a word processor, and also work mentally. There's just a difference. So you use your eyes. Well, we did on a typewriter too. But it wasn't, you see, we'd write something, then we sat back and looked at it. Well, they do too, but they also have to watch that word processor every minute and so on. Well, as I say, I don't know that you can coordinate as well visually and mentally but maybe that's just sour grapes or something.
Mhm.
But it's here to stay. It doesn't make any difference.
Mhm. Well, I think we have a good interview.
Well, I think it's been awful yak-yacky. I don't know anything I've told you. If this is of any interest for the Chronicles of Oklahoma, why?
What's your favorite memory of your newspaper days?
I think probably the people I've come in contact with are the things that have interested me as much, the personalities that one interviews through the years. For instance, I spent 3 days following Oral Roberts and Billy Graham around. They weren't doing anything but playing golf, but anytime either one of them opened their mouth, it was national news. And as I say, celebrities, stage-wise, that have been here. As I said, I've covered everything from, I've covered symphony, ballet. In other words, I pinch hit when somebody wanted to send somebody up back and go up and do the ballet tonight or do the Philharmonic or this, that, and the other. And celebrities through the years and so on. That I think probably a person that stands out in my mind as much as any individual, and this was back in the church editor days. Do you know anything about a faith healer by the name of Catherine Coleman?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I covered Catherine 3 times and had some rather intimate interviews with her. And probably because of the faith healing and so on, and the people that she drew, and the atmosphere, she stands out as one of the interesting. And of course, Billy Graham I loved with a passion. He was 2 different individuals. He was completely the man of the world, the suave politician, and then he became the evangelist. But he had relatives here in town. So I asked him about 4 o'clock one afternoon. I said, I called him Billy. I said, Billy, we'd sure like to get a picture of you. You're going to have dinner with your relatives tonight, I understand. And he said, yes, I am. And I said, could we come out and take a picture? I know it's an imposition and so on to break into a family. Oh, sure, come on out. We'd just love to have you. So we went out and became part of the family. And as I say, trying to think, of course, the more recent things in your mind stand out. The more recent things.
Did you know Henry Bellman?
Did I know who?
Do you know Henry Bellman?
Oh, yes. I grew up with Henry.
What was he like growing up with him?
Well, you see, there were 2 families of the Bellman children. They lived on a farm south of... Well, Henry is of the younger Bellman family. Mr. Bellman married twice. Well, the kids that I spent time with, I was out the Bellmans weekend after weekend, but the kids I spent time with were his older sisters and brothers. So Henry was just a kid. In fact, how old is Henry? You see, he was very young when I left Billings, actually. So my contact has been with him more since he became politically and so on. And the governors of the state, I've interviewed and dealt with most all of them. And of course, I loved Bob Kerr, and I saw him when I was back in Washington. We always tried to establish the kid we took back with some of the politicians. So I was trying to see Bob, and somebody said, he's in the barber shop. And I said, well, I don't want to go in the barber shop and bother him. And this colored said, oh, go on in, Bob won't care. So we went in. I said, Mr. Kerr, I just want you to meet a youngster that I have from Oklahoma. Oh, sure. He took the towel off his neck and wiped off his face and so on. And I was closely associated with Mike Monroney, who was a tremendous individual. I was quite closely associated with Hall. And speaking of Bob Kerr and his accessibility, that was one thing. He was making a speech here that I was covering. Well, he was still governor, and it was right on deadline. So I went up to the stage and I said, Governor, I'm in a jam. I would like very much to get at least a few quotes is what you're going to say, and I'm right on deadline. He said, "Oh, sure, Wilma." And he came off and stood and told me enough, that I had a story and so on. And of course, Hall was around enough, he was a native.
Who was your favorite governor that you interviewed?
I think Bob Kerr.
Bob Kerr.
Except I have great respect for Henry Belton. Great respect. And I think David, now I've not had contact particularly with Boron, so I don't know him personally and so on.
What impressed you most about Kerr besides his accessibility?
I think probably the fact that I thought he had extremely good grasp on a number of fields. In other words, he was wise as far as Oklahoma oil was concerned and what was needed there. He was astute in financing. He had great concern in environmental problems and that type of thing. And of course, he was very, the waterways and his conception of all that was, I think that was the thing that I thought made him a very outstanding governor and congressman or senator.
What about Bill Murray?
Oh, Bill. We were very closely associated with Johnson, too. Johnson was a pal of ours. But the first time I interviewed old Bill, he came to Tonkawa to make a speech. Well, again, being an afternoon newspaper, you're always on deadline. So I went in to the restaurant where he was eating breakfast. And I introduced myself, and I said, "Mr. Murray, I represent the Ponca City News. I would like very much, I'm going to be right on deadline, and I can't do your speech any justice. If you could give me a few quotes or give me an idea of what you're going to say." Well, he reared back and looked at me, and he said, "Young woman, I don't talk to nobody before breakfast, least of all newspaper reporters." So that took care of Bill. Well, I really didn't cover him much after that. I don't remember, he dropped out of the picture, of course. But Johnson, his son, and his wife Willie and Ben and I were very close friends. Johnson was in Tonkawa. And after he went went down to Oklahoma City and so on, Willie came up one day, and please don't quote this, because this is definitely off the record. But she came up one day and said, "Wilma, I'm going to elect Johnson governor of Oklahoma." And knowing Willie, I thought, well, if anybody can do it, you can. And I said, "Well, Willie, I'll give you all the help I possibly can." And she said, "Well, I'm going to call on you for certain things." Said, "The first place, he needs to be exposed." And we were having a gridiron come up about that time. You know the gridiron?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Well, I can get Johnson up the gridiron and have him introduced and so on and so forth. Is he going to announce before that?" Well, she didn't know for sure. I don't remember when he announced. But anyway, we took him to the gridiron. I didn't take him, but then I arranged to have him there and introduced and pretty much in the limelight. So from then on, we were pretty much involved in the, not actively, but personally involved in Johnson's campaign.
Did you know his first wife?
Did I what?
Did you know his first wife?
Willie, that's what I'm talking about.
No, his first wife.
Mm-hmm.
She's the second wife.
I don't know. No, wait a minute. Was Willie his second wife? I don't remember. She was the only wife I knew. I guess he had been married before. And I never knew. He brought this second wife up to a gridiron after Willie's death. But I had very, just casual.
No, I interviewed her, his first wife. Mm-hmm. And when he was campaigning for governor, a thing came out about a scandal.
Mm-hmm. I don't remember that in that.
Her name was Marion.
Who was his first wife?
I can't think of what her maiden name was. I have it at the.
Well, he was married to Willie when I first went to Tonkawa, so that was
they were only married just like 3 or 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever he was running for governor, a scandal came out, something about his first wife.
Really?
And she came up
Mm-hmm.
and when they had this big campaign going, and came out for Johnson,
For Johnson.
and of course,
Well, I don't remember that. That just is
yeah,
gone completely as
yeah.
far as I'm
Well,
concerned.
they were only married just a very few years.
Mhm.
They were involved in the Murray Colony in South America. You know, when they went down in the 20s.
You know, Willie was a very accomplished pianist.
Who was your favorite First Lady?
Well, I think I'd go for Lady Bell. Although I had more contact with Lady than any other. But I was at a National Press Club gridiron with Mamie.
Oh, I'm sorry, I meant in the governors of Oklahoma.
Oh, of Oklahoma.
The governor's wives.
Well, really, I haven't had just a great deal of contact. I have great respect for Mrs. Bartlett. Oh, Dewey Bartlett's another guy that was very high on my list. But as far as very intimate or actually doing any coverage of them, I didn't. So I couldn't say that I've actually had a favorite, First Lady of Oklahoma. I like Molly Boren. I think she's outstanding as an individual. But again, that's just been casual, just social meetings, not business, not newspapering. Oh, and I like Mrs. Kerr, but she was quite an individual too. But as far as any favorite, no.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
But we should. You better delete some of this. You better delete because I've just rattled on.
what else would you like to talk about?
I really don't know anything. I really don't. Except newspapers, been my life. I've loved every minute of it. I always said when I went to work, I really went to work. Of course, it hasn't been all wine and roses, as everybody knows.
Mm-hmm.
But a newspaper has been my great love. And I shall never cease to miss it. Of course, I was ready and it was time to leave. But I'll never cease to miss it. And the electronic media can never take its place.
Well, thank you.
Well, I've enjoyed talking to you. Heavens, it's been very nostalgic. I've thought about things I haven't thought about for years. And he was trying to establish the Tonkawa language. Well, there was only one person, old John Rush, who was alive at that time who he was able to get any information from.
John Rush?
He's long since gone. He was a Tonkawa.
Is Tonkawa, is the language still spoken?
Is it what?
Is the language still spoken?
I don't think so.
Did you know any Tonkawas?
Oh yes, you see, John was the only full-blood, and he used to come down and sit around the office half of the time. He was a really tractor, Indian, how they come to sit. And of course, when I first went to Tonkawa, they were still coming in with their blankets, sitting on the streets. But then we had a very interesting friend who was chieftain of the cause, Emmett Thompson. And when Emmett died, this was when we were still, it's been long ago, but it was still almost modern time. They had quite a lovely home in Ponca City, swimming pools, this, that, and the other. And the cause came in and camped on the yard and keened. They lived right across the street from good friends of ours. And they said it almost drove them crazy. They were there for 2 or 3 days. So it was just a little bit back, just a little bit back.
Are there any Tonkawas left now?
No full-bloods. John was the last full-blood. Now I know there isn't, because there weren't any full-bloods when this guy came down, and that's just been 50 years ago. But I'm sure there's some mixed breeds there. I don't know how many full-blood Osages there are.
I don't know.
I'll bet they're getting few and far between.
I know Mary Standing Bear's probably one of the last.
Probably.
Full-bloods.
She'll be able to tell you how many there are. I have a friend, in fact, she does my hair, who is Cherokee, one of the Cooksons, you know, the Cookson Hills, etc. And she's mixed up with everybody in Cherokee County, but there's no full-blood sled. She was, her grandfather was a half, and her grandmother was a half. So she's pretty far down the line. But she still gets Indian benefits, which, I don't think that's that is. She gets medical treatment and so on. Very interesting. Speaking of the war years, the boys out at the camp were, of course, intrigued with Indians. So we'd take them over when they were having the powwows at Pawnee and down south of Ponca City. I forget what that place is. And they'd get out and dance with the Indians and have more fun.
Were these the Germans?
No, the Germans were never allowed out like that. These were the MPs and the officers who were stationed out in the camp.
How large was that camp? How big was it?
It was a pretty big camp, I would say now. I wrote a story about that camp after I came over here. I was looking through some old clippings the other day. I think it had probably around 1,400 personnel, something. Now that's just way out in the ballpark. Maybe 2,000. But they brought in no prisoners after they brought in the African Corps. And of course it wasn't a great military contingent. But I'd say 1,500, something like that.